They called him Stable Tom for 28 years, and not one of the 416 souls in Caldwell Springs, Kansas, ever asked him his Christian name. They would learn it the morning after the fire, when the doctor went looking through the livery for next of kin and found a folded paper in a tin box under a horse blanket. Thomas Eli Greer, born June the 3rd, 1895, mother deceased. By then it was already too late to say it to his face, but it hadn't always been too late. There were 28 years of mornings before that one, and this is the story of the last of them. It begins the way every morning began for him, at first light in the livery stable at the south end of the one street that was the whole of the town. The prairie wind was already up, dry and cold, smelling of cured grass and the winter that was coming on hard. October in Kansas in 1923, straw-colored land stretching all the way to where the sky started, a sky so wide a man could feel small inside it and somehow held by it at the same time. Thomas was in the third stall with the Henderson roan, her left forefoot cradled between his knees, the rasp going slow and even across the hoof. He hummed while he worked. He always hummed while he worked. There is a fountain filled with blood, drawn from Emmanuel's veins. The old hymn, low in his chest, the kind of humming a man does when he has been alone so long, the song has become a second way of breathing. The mare's ear flicked back to listen. Horses had always listened to him. People had been harder. He was a tall man, lean from a life of hard labor and short rations, with hands that looked older than the rest of him because they had been doing this work since he was 9 years old. Around his neck, on a leather cord gone black with sweat and time, hung a small wooden cross no bigger than the joint of his thumb. His mother had carved it for him on the bed where she died. He had been 4. He did not remember her face. He remembered the smell of pine shavings, and her voice saying, "You remember whose you are, Thomas? You remember?" He had remembered. He had remembered every day. He finished the mare and led her back to her stall and put out fresh hay, and stood a moment with his hand on her neck. "There now, girl," he said. "There now." Then he washed at the pump out back, put on the jacket that was too thin for the morning, settled the hat that had been his only hat for 9 years, and walked up the boardwalk to start the rest of his day. He swept in front of 3 storefronts before the town was properly awake: the dry goods, the feed store, the apothecary. None of the 3 would let him buy so much as a spool of thread inside their doors. The owners had an arrangement with him that none of them had ever spoken aloud. He swept their walks for nothing. They left whatever he needed on a crate by the back step, and he paid in coin slipped under a stone. Everyone understood. Nobody called it what it was. The first woman to pass him was Mrs. Halloran, on her way to the post office with a basket on her arm. He stopped sweeping, took off his hat, and said, "Mornin', ma'am." She kept walking as if the air had spoken. The second was the school teacher, Miss Pratt, who at least gave him a tight nod that did not involve her eyes. The third was a girl of about 7, who looked up at him with the open face children have before the world teaches them what to do with it, and said, "Good morning, mister," and her mother yanked her hand so hard the child's shoulder jerked. Thomas went on sweeping. He did not stop humming. There is a fountain filled with blood. The dust rose and settled and rose again. By mid-morning the sun had climbed enough to take the bite out of the wind, and Thomas walked the long way around the back of Main Street to the alley behind the Garrison House, the big white 2-story with the green shutters at the north end of town. He did not knock. He never knocked. He stood at the bottom of the back step and waited, the way he had waited for 9 years. and after a minute the screen door eased open, and old Mrs. Garrison was there in her shawl, her hair still in its night braid, her eyes so clouded over with cataracts that she had to find him by sound. "Thomas?" she said. "Yes, ma'am, it's me. I got you a piece of bread, son, and a little bit of that ham left from Sunday. You eat it now, don't save it." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." She handed the bundle through the screen, wrapped in a flour sack cloth, and her fingers brushed his. 81 years old, half blind, the only door in Caldwell Springs that had ever opened for him. She squinted out into the light. "You warm enough in that jacket?" "I'm fine, ma'am." "You're a liar, Thomas Greer, but the Lord forgives you." A small, tired smile from him. "Yes, ma'am, I expect he does." She nodded once, the way old women nod when they have said the only thing worth saying, and the screen door eased shut. He walked back to the livery the long way, eating the bread slowly, making it last, the wind pulling at the brim of his hat. He passed the Methodist church and tipped his hat to the cross over the door the way he tipped it to women who would not look at him, and he sang under his breath the rest of the hymn. "And sinners plunged beneath that flood lose all their guilty stains." A wagon rolled past. The driver did not look down. The dust settled on Thomas's shoulders, and he walked on through it. "Now, I want you to hear me carefully. The town thought it knew him. The town thought he was simple. The town thought the humming was a habit, and the hat-tipping was the manners of a servile man, and the Bible they sometimes saw him reading on a feed sack behind the livery was a curiosity, the way a dog walking on its hind legs is a curiosity. The town was wrong. The town had been wrong about him every single day for 28 years, and the town had 10 days left to be wrong before the wind out of the west would teach it otherwise. But that morning the wind was only cold, and the bread was only bread. And Thomas Eli Greer went back to his stable and picked up his rasp and started on the next horse, humming, with the little wooden cross his mother had carved warm against the skin over his heart. Old Hiram Beasley, who had owned the livery for 41 years and had taken Thomas in the winter the boy's mother died, went to sleep on a Tuesday night and did not wake up on Wednesday morning. Thomas found him at 5 o'clock when he carried in the coffee. The old man's hand was already cold on the quilt. Thomas stood there a long moment with the tin cup steaming in his fingers, and then he set the cup down on the nightstand and closed Hiram's eyes with 2 fingers the way he had once seen Doc Pruitt do it, and he said, low, "Go on home, Mr. Hiram. You go on home." Then he knelt by the bed and prayed the Lord's Prayer all the way through, slow, the way Hiram had taught him to pray it when he was 10 years old, in that same back room with a kerosene lamp between them. When he got to, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us," his voice did not catch. It had stopped catching on that line a long time ago. The nephew came in on the Thursday train from Topeka. His name was Calvin Beasley, and he was a thin man in a new suit who had not seen his uncle in 9 years, and who looked at the livery the way a man looks at a piece of paper he is about to sign. He found Thomas in the tack room oiling a saddle. He did not take off his hat. "You'd be the colored boy my uncle kept on," he said. "Yes, sir. Thomas Greer." Calvin Beasley nodded as if the name had not registered and would not need to. "I'm selling the place. Buyer's coming through next month. You'll need to be out by Sunday." Thomas set the rag down on the bench. The wind was working at the loose board on the north wall. He could hear it ticking. "Yes, sir," he said. "Sunday. You got somewhere to go?" "I expect the Lord'll show me, sir." Calvin Beasley made a small sound through his nose that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else, and he walked out into the yard and did not look back. Thomas stood in the tack room a while. He picked the rag back up. He kept oiling the saddle. There is an old prairie saying, "When the Lord shuts a door, He has not always built you another one yet," and you wait in the hallway. Thomas waited in the hallway. He did not weep. He did not pack. He worked his way through Thursday and Friday with the same slow hands and the same low humming. And on Saturday evening he washed his face at the pump, beat the dust out of his jacket, and walked up the street to the Methodist church because Wendell Garrison's 2 children were being baptized that night, and Thomas had known the boy since the day he was born. Nobody had invited him. Nobody turned him away. He stood at the back of the sanctuary with his hat in both hands, the way a man stands at a grave, and he watched. The kerosene lamps along the walls threw long, soft shadows up the wood plank ceiling. The minister, Reverend Hollis, was a thin man with a tired voice that he saved up for Sundays. Wendell Garrison stood at the front in a stiff black coat, his hand on his wife Lila's elbow. The boy, James, was 4 and would not stand still. The girl, Ruth, was almost 3 and held a rag doll by one foot. The baby, Sarah, 8 months old, was asleep on her grandmother's shoulder in the second pew. Old Mrs. Garrison, in her good Sunday hat, the only person in the room who turned her cloudy eyes toward the back of the sanctuary and gave the smallest nod when she felt, rather than saw, Thomas come in. Reverend Hollis touched water to the boy's forehead. He touched water to the girl's forehead. He spoke the names the way a minister speaks names, slow, as if each one weighed something. Then they sang. The piano started low, and the congregation rose. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Thomas did not need a hymn book. He had known every verse of it since he was 11. He did not mean to sing. He meant to stand quiet in the back and let the song wash over him the way water washes over a stone. But the harmony was right there under the melody, low and waiting, and his throat opened without his permission. He sang it under his breath, softer than a whisper. The woman in the pew in front of him was Edna Mosley, who had crossed the street to avoid him every Tuesday for 19 years. Edna heard something at her shoulder that she could not place. She thought at first it was a draft. Then she thought it was the wind in the eaves. Then she understood it was a man's voice singing the harmony to Amazing Grace right behind her, low and clean, and trained by nothing but practice in an empty stable. And she turned her head a little, just enough, and saw Thomas Greer with his eyes closed and his lips barely moving and his face wet. She turned forward again fast. She did not sing the next verse. Her hands were shaking on the hymn book. She told her husband later that she had felt strange, and he told her it was the heat, and she did not say what she had heard because she did not have words for what she had heard. The congregation sang on. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Thomas opened his eyes and looked at the back of Wendell Garrison's coat and at the small, bright head of the boy beside him, and his lips kept moving, and the cross under his shirt was warm against his breastbone. When it was over, he slipped out before the last amen and walked back down the street under a sky full of cold stars, and the wind was already up out of the west, dry and strong, And he stood for a moment in the middle of the empty road and looked at it. He did not know what he was looking for. He climbed up to the hayloft in the livery, took off his boots, folded his jacket for a pillow, and laid down. He prayed 3 things. Lord, take care of Mr. Hiram. Lord, show me where to go. Lord, keep them babies. Then he slept. The wind came up harder out of the west. In the garrison kitchen, on a high shelf above the stove, a kerosene lamp Lila had left burning low because the baby had been fussy, sat 1/4 inch closer to the edge than it had been the night before. At 10 minutes after 3 in the morning, the wind hit the kitchen window so hard it rattled the sash, and the lamp went over. The flame caught the curtain caught the wallpaper. The wallpaper caught the dry pine of a house that had stood empty of rain for 7 weeks. In the hayloft, a half-mile away, Thomas Eli Greer was dreaming nothing at all. And then he was sitting straight up in the dark, with 3 words ringing in his head as clear as a bell struck at noon. Get up, run. He did not stop for his boots. He went down the loft ladder barefoot, hit the stable floor running, grabbed his jacket off the nail, and was through the door before his mind had caught up with his body. He saw the orange glow first, low against the northern sky, and he understood before he understood. He ran. The wind was at his back, and the dust rose around his bare feet, and the cross bounced against his chest, and he ran the half-mile of Main Street in the time it took most men to think about running. And when he came around the corner of the Garrison house, he was the first soul there. The whole back of the house was already a wall of fire. Wendell was on the lawn in his nightshirt screaming the children's names. Lila was on her knees in the dirt. Old Mrs. Garrison was holding the porch rail with both hands and shaking. The bucket brigade was nowhere yet. Thomas did not stop. He did not ask. He did not look at Wendell. He pulled his jacket up over his mouth and went in through the back door because the back door was where the fire had been longest, and that meant the front rooms had a few minutes left. He came out the front in under a minute with the boy James limp over his shoulder and laid him in his mother's lap and turned around and went back in. He came out the second time with the girl Ruth in his arms, coughing, alive, and he set her down beside her brother. His face was black with smoke. His hands were already burned. He stood up. He was breathing like a man who has just run his last race. And then old Mrs. Garrison's voice came out of her, cracked and terrible. "The baby! Oh, God, the baby! Sarah's upstairs! Wendell, the baby!" Wendell Garrison stood frozen on the lawn. His mouth was open. His feet would not move. He was a man who had been the quiet king of a small town for 30 years, and in this moment, he was a child who had never been taught what to do with what was real. Thomas turned and looked at him. Just looked. The fire was in the upstairs windows now. The roof was beginning to give. There was no time for what should have been said between them. There was only time for what was said. "I'll get her, Mr. Garrison." That was all. He said it quiet, the way he had said, "Yes, ma'am," to old Mrs. Garrison at her back door for 9 years. Then Thomas Eli Greer pulled the jacket up over his mouth one more time, and he walked back into the fire. He came out of that house the third time the way a man comes up out of deep water, slow, broken, and not all the way back. The roof had gone in behind him. His shirt was burned to the skin of his shoulders.
His hair was singed down to the scalp on one side.
But the baby Sarah was alive in the crook of his left arm, wrapped in a quilt he had pulled off her crib, and her tiny fist had found the leather cord at his neck in the dark and would not let it go. He took 4 steps onto the lawn, and his knees folded under him, and he laid the baby down in her mother's arms before he let himself fall. Doc Pruitt got there with his bag a minute later and took one look and said, "Get a horse blanket. Get him to my parlor. Now." 4 men lifted him. Wendell Garrison was one of them. Wendell's hands were shaking so hard he could barely keep his grip on the corner of the blanket. They carried Thomas Eli Greer down Main Street, under a sky that had begun to lighten at the eastern edge, and behind them the Garrison house collapsed in on itself with a sound like a great, tired sigh, and the bucket brigade stopped throwing water because there was nothing left to save. They laid him on the cot in Doc Pruitt's parlor. The doctor cut the shirt away in strips and did not say what he saw. He did not have to. Lila Garrison, holding the baby still in the doorway, made a sound nobody who heard it ever forgot. Old Mrs. Garrison came in behind her in her nightgown with a shawl thrown over it, and she walked straight to the cot and put her hand on Thomas's good forearm where the skin was not burned, and she said, "I'm here, son. Mother's here." She had never called him son aloud before. She had called him son inside her heart for 9 years. Word travels fast in a town of 19 buildings on one street. By 4 in the morning, the parlor was lit with every lamp in the house, and by 4:30, the people of Caldwell Springs had begun to come, one by one, the way people come to a wake before the body is called. They came with their hats in their hands. They did not speak above a whisper. They formed a line out the front door and down the porch and into the yard, and Doc Pruitt did not have the heart to send them away. Mr. Hennessy from the dry goods came first. He stood at the foot of the cot and turned his hat in a circle 3 times, and then he said, low, "Thomas, I should have let you come in the front door. There wasn't no reason. There wasn't never no reason. I'm sorry, son." Thomas's eyes were closed. His chest rose, it fell, it rose again. Miss Pratt, the school teacher, came next, and she could not get the words out at first, and then she did. "I crossed the street from you for 15 years, she said, "and I taught children to do the same. God forgive me. God forgive me, Thomas." Reverend Hollis came in and stood a long time before he spoke. He had shaken Thomas's hand exactly once in 15 years, at the funeral of a stranger passing through, and he had wiped his palm on his coat afterward, and had been ashamed of it for 15 years, and had never once let himself remember the shame. He remembered it now. "I preach the gospel over your head every Sunday," he said, "and I never once invited you in to hear it from a pew. The Lord help me. The Lord help me." Edna Mosley came, the woman from the baptism, and she said only, "I heard you sing. I heard you. I'm sorry I didn't turn around sooner." They came like that for 2 hours. The storekeeper, the blacksmith, the widow Halloran, whose name he had tipped his hat to 1,000 mornings. Each one said the thing they had not said in life, and each one walked out of that parlor a smaller person than they had walked in, and a truer one. And last of all came Wendell Garrison. He had been standing on the porch the whole time. He could not make himself come in. When the line was finally finished and the room was quiet, he stepped through the door and walked to the cot, and his legs would not hold him, and he went down on his knees beside it. He had not knelt in 15 years. He laid his forehead on Thomas's unburned hand, and the great, quiet king of Caldwell Springs broke open like a clay jar dropped on stone. "Forgive me, brother," he wept. "Forgive me. I never once called you brother. I never asked your name. My children are alive because of you, and I never— Oh, God, Thomas, forgive me." Thomas's eyes opened, just barely. He looked at the top of Wendell's bowed head a long moment, and then he lifted his good hand, the one without burns, and laid it on Wendell's hair the way a father lays his hand on a son. His voice, when it came, was no more than breath. "Already done, Mr. Wendell. Been done a long time. You go on home now. You go on home and love them babies." Wendell could not answer. He could only weep. Thomas closed his eyes. The first light came pale and gold through the east window of the parlor, and it touched his face, and his chest rose one more time, and it fell, and it did not rise again. Doc Pruitt waited a long minute before he reached down and closed Thomas's eyes with 2 fingers. Then he stood up and walked over to the chair where someone had set the few things they had brought from the livery: a folded jacket, a tin cup, the battered Bible the circuit preacher had left behind 11 years before. The Bible had fallen on the floor at some point in the night and lay open. Doc Pruitt bent and picked it up, and his hand stopped. He read what was on the page. He read it again. Then he turned to the room, to Wendell still kneeling, to Lila with the baby, to the minister in the corner with his face in his hands. And he read it aloud, and his voice was not steady. "He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted." The parlor could not breathe. Doc Pruitt closed the Bible. He laid it on Thomas's chest. Then he reached down and gently worked the leather cord over the dead man's head, and the little wooden cross, the one a woman dying of fever had carved for her 4-year-old son in 1899, came free in his palm. He turned to Wendell Garrison, and he opened Wendell's hand, and he placed the cross in it and closed Wendell's fingers around it. "He carried this his whole life," the doctor said. "You carry it now." They buried him 3 days later in the White Cemetery on the rise east of town, in a plot Wendell Garrison purchased with his own money and would not let anyone else pay a cent toward. The whole town came. The headstone was simple pine at first, and then in the spring Wendell ordered marble from Kansas City, and when it came it bore only 4 words: Thomas Eli Greer, brother. Calvin Beasley, the nephew, sold the livery and went back to Topeka, and was never spoken of in Caldwell Springs again. Reverend Hollis preached a different gospel after that, a smaller one, a humbler one that no longer wiped its hand on its coat. Edna Mosley taught herself the alto line of every hymn in the book and sang it out loud where people could hear. Old Mrs. Garrison lived another 4 years, and on her last day asked to be buried as near to Thomas as the cemetery would allow, and they laid her 3 rows down the slope. And Wendell Garrison, Wendell, who had been the quiet king, kept the little wooden cross on the corner of his desk at the grain mill for the next 41 years,
until his own death in 1964. Every Sunday of those 41 years, he sat in the back pew of the Methodist Church, in the spot where Thomas had stood the night of the baptism. And when his grandchildren asked him why he would not sit up front with the family, he would only say, "I have not earned it yet. Maybe next Sunday." He never said it.
He died in that back pew on a Sunday in June, an old man with a small wooden cross in his coat pocket, and the man who washed his body for burial found it there, and did not know what it meant, and put it in the casket with him. And so it went into the ground at last. Now hear me, you who are listening. There are men walking among us right now whose worth we have not bothered to measure. There are women whose names we have not bothered to learn. There is somebody who sweeps the walk you walk on, who pours the coffee you drink, who stands at the back of the room you sit in the front of. And the Christ in them is shining so plain that one day we will stand before the throne and have to answer why we did not see it. The world called Thomas Eli Greer invisible for 28 years. Heaven called him by his full name from the day he was born. And the town of Caldwell Springs, Kansas, learned to see him only by the light of the fire he walked into for them. 3 times. The last time for a child they had forgotten was even in the house. May God spare us the mercy of learning that late. May God open our eyes while the door is still open and the name is still ours to speak. If this story found you tonight, do not let it pass through you and leave nothing behind. Think of the one you have walked past. Think of the hand you have not shaken. Go and learn that person's Christian name before the wind comes up out of the west. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the kingdom of God does not ask what color the door is, only whether you opened it. And if you would like the next story to find you when it is meant to, subscribe and walk in peace.